So I think to kind of begin the large part of the argument that Truman is going to get into, he expounds upon this idea of what is the social imaginary, and the phrase specifically is from Charles Taylor. Now, the social imaginary is this: it's the basic ideas that form how an individual in a society thinks about themselves, how they approach the world, how they act in the world. It's kind of this catch-all term, because when we're dealing with where culture is today, we so often look at things like the postmodern philosophers, and we're right to do so. We can look at a Lyotard or a Derrida or these various figures that are really important for Michel Foucault, probably more foundationally than many others, in terms of his view of power dynamics, that is very influential for where our culture has gone today. But when we look at these kinds of things, we think, okay, well, these are these kind of French, largely, philosophers in the academy. What does that have to do with the average Joe, down the road from me in upstate New York? Like, what do those two things have to do with each other? This person has probably never even heard of Michel Foucault, but so, like, what's the relevance of what they think, and what's the connection here? Well, the social imaginary is this catch-all phrase to identify more than just what's going on in the academy. Now, when we're understanding what's going on in the academy, though, what we have to see is that the ideas that may seem abstract or unimportant, those ideas do trickle down. Okay, they do trickle down to the mainstream. Now, they don't do it through a series of academic lectures in your town square and everybody circles around and it's like, I want to hear about deconstruction. Of course, like, obviously not. But it does come down in different ways. Generally, that is done through the arts, and through the popularization of the arts. Now, even when you're speaking about art, you could certainly talk about art as it is for the academy, or art as it is in terms of kind of high culture, or art as it influences the elite. So it's not like the average person is going to be influenced by, say, Jeff Koons, or some other popular artist today, or Tracy Emin or something. As much as those artists do say actually a heck of a lot about where our culture and society is. But no, what they're gonna see is the jokes that are in their favorite comedies that they watch on TV, and the references to those things, and the rhetoric that they hear from their talking heads on TV, news anchors, or people they hear on the radio, or the kind of language they're going to see in the New York Times, articles that are posted on Facebook. So the ideas do trickle down from the academy. They do come down to the average person. Now, the average person doesn't have the background, and nor do they need to. It's not like I'm advocating for the responsibility of every individual to have some extensive knowledge of Michel Foucault or Karl Marx or whoever. Though I do think that our educational system, if we're doing it properly, will give somewhat of a grounding in these ideas so we can think critically enough to evaluate. But those works are largely impenetrable, especially when we're talking about the postmodernists. And then when we get to like the gender theorists too, like Judith Butler. I mean, it's yes, and I've read to Judith Butler, and yes, I understood it, but it takes a lot of work, and it's purposefully obscure in terms of the language that is used. So it's not accessible. It's not supposed to be accessible. But it comes down to us in a watered down format through our media. And if you look at someone like Antonio Gramsci, who advocated, and we could talk about him later, I don't want to get too much into this, but he advocated for kind of social revolution via the media. And this is purposeful. That it's understood that if you take over the educational institutions of a society, you take over the media of a society, and you push certain ideas, that will then become the idea of the populace. That's true. I mean, that's what we're seeing. We are seeing that a particular ideological group has taken over the media in many ways. It's just a fact. I mean, it's very clear that there are certain biases, there are certain moral ideas that do control, by and large, what happens in our media and what happens in our educational institutions. And to some degree, and I've made this point before, to some degree that's kind of inevitable because a society can't exist without values. And this is one of the problems with where liberalism has gone, is, and I'm not totally opposed to liberalism. I think there are good things there as well. But when you do get an attempt at a pure secularity within society, it just doesn't work. You can't. You have to have its values as a society. What we're seeing is that our society is now constructing its own values based on how it has identified the modern self. So it's not a valueless society. There's no such thing as a secular neutral society. It's an impossibility. We need a moral and really a religious framework to stand behind society. Anybody that tells you things like, well, we can't legislate morality via the government, those kinds of myths that we have, that we can just have this, pure secularity, it's just not true. I mean, what do you mean you can't legislate morality? Of course you can legislate morality. That's exactly what government is for. There's no sense in having law if you don't legislate morality. Because to say that, well, every individual has to have the freedom to make their own decisions and the government just is there to allow that to happen, well, you're making a moral judgment and statement. You're saying that individual liberty and freedom is good and that impinging upon others' freedoms is not good. That is a moral judgment, and you are getting the government involved in moral decision making as soon as you say that. There's no way around that. So, of course you legislate morality. The question isn't, do we legislate morality? Yeah, and politicians can argue about, well, what morality do we legislate? What things do we leave up to personal decision? And where does the government step in? Where does it not step in? And I'm not a politician, so I don't have to give you those answers. But the point is that you have to legislate morality to some degree. That's the purpose and function of government. And that often will come down to some degree to a regulation of speech. And that's what we're seeing, at least in terms of social pressure. Because you can regulate speech via social pressure, not just in terms of what the government says is literally illegal to say. And John Stuart Mill deals with this. There was something I heard from Robert George recently on this, and I have my Mill here that I was reading on liberty. He has a section, and I don't have the page number in front of me, sorry. But he speaks about this, that we're speaking about coercion in terms of language and what can be said and what can't be said. We're not just talking about what the government says is illegal or will jail you for saying this or that, but it comes down to a largely social pressure. And that isn't always bad either. Like, there are certain things that are said that should be shamed by society. Does that mean we should stifle debate? No. But we could talk about where we are as a culture today in terms of those questions. But to some degree, we have to say that, yeah, there are going to be moral boundaries as a society. We have to have that. So all of that is part of what's described as this social imaginary. So we have just the ideas of the average person, the way they live their life, the way they think about themselves, the way they think about the world. A lot of that is unconscious. The majority of people aren't thinking through all of the implications of what they believe or where they got these ideas from. The majority of people don't have to do that. It's not like there's a requirement for everyone to have a PhD in philosophy and think through these issues. But this is just the fact. This is the reality that we are living in. We all have these kinds of social imaginaries. We can't avoid that.